then broadens near the end of the war as the Germans throw the V1 and V2 into the mix. And so air power becomes not just what you can deliver with an airplane, but what you can deliver with the V1 is a very early cruise missile, and the V2 is an ICBM, or at least a rocket that goes out of the atmosphere. So you start seeing in the Second World War the broadening of what makes for air power. Nowadays, there's really a bit of confusion about that. Because what do you do if you can now, some people used to say, oh, big difference between why is a bomb dropped from a plane air power, but a shell fired 20 miles from an artillery piece, not air power. They're both being projected a long distance, and the shell goes in the air, and the argument is, well, the shell is not controllable in the air. Air power is flexible. That argument's over. By the way, you control many shells in the air now. So when you fire from an MLRS system, you are firing maneuverable ordnance. What drones are, Army people say drones are extensions of artillery. They shouldn't use air power. Air power people say drones are indeed air power. You know, and when you look at a drone that's carrying a little grenade, a little thing that flies around, is that air power? Is that ground power? So I'm just throwing that out there, that when we use the phrase air power, that actual concept now might not be appropriate to what we're talking about. We could be talking about ranged power or a different kind of capability as opposed to platform-driven. Air power is platform-driven, where the platform is. And it might be that that is no longer the best way to describe it, but I'm going to use it, and I'm going to use it in terms of the Second World War. Now, if you know the book, in a nutshell, and what I said yesterday, air power determined much of the war, particularly the war in Europe. And this started from the very early part in the construction. That building aircraft, I showed that graph yesterday, takes up far more of everybody's economy than any other part of the world. That for the Germans, it's usually well over 50%. When you add the airframes to the ammunition and everything to arm the aircraft, for the British and Americans, it would have been the same, maybe a little bit more, depending on what year you're talking about. And they are also the most technologically advanced. They are the most technologically advanced parts of the war, so that building one aircraft in investment terms is often building 10 or 20 things. That's what it costs to put them out. I wanted to show, I'm going to jump ahead, because I mentioned this plane yesterday and people were a little confused. This is the Heinkel 177, and you're saying, why have I never heard about it? It's because it's a terrible aircraft that could never do a job. The Germans spent more on it than any other weapon system, except maybe the V2. I've been trying to get a comparative investment. But basically, other than the V2, this weapon system in development stage cost the Germans far more than anything else. Far more than tanks, far more than any other sort of piece of equipment. And yet they could never get it to fly, partly because you can see that it's that enormous double engine they have on the front with the one propeller. So it is the German response, or the German attempt to build a 4-engine bomber, something like an American B-17 or British Lancaster. An incredibly good airframe. You can see it's actually one of the first to have the domed front, so it flew exceptionally well as an airframe when the engine didn't explode. So,
two engines drive.
Then basically, this is two. There are two engines housed in that case. So the German, and it was that you can see the argument was it's an aerodynamic issue. You don't have 4 blobs on the wings. You have 2 blobs on the wings, so it's better aerodynamics. The problem is it just didn't work as a system, and they eventually stopped doing it. But it's a kind of investment. They could have. Comparative is hard, but they would have put as much into building that and designing that as they would have put into sort of all Tiger tanks. But you've never heard of it. It's just an example of the costs of an aircraft development program. So there, I just put that picture up there. And the same also for the American B-29, which is the most expensive weapon system of the war, more than the atom bomb. The Americans spent more developing a very long-range bomber. Certainly the Germans spent a huge amount for its jet fighter, the Messerschmitt 262. They only get into service in late 1944. So if you go across the piece and you add development costs, production costs, air power goes probably from, in the German case, 55% of production. I would say arguably 70 or 80% of development costs. If you add the B2s, B1s with all the air. So you're talking a massive part of the German economy. Same with the American reducing restriction. They just spend huge amounts doing this. And they operate in all theaters and all domains, because basically aircraft become the multi-purpose we can throw them in anywhere. Now, I'm going to take you in the next few slides through the phases of the war that I talked about yesterday, sort of pre-production, production, and deployment phases, and show actually that air power, particularly in Europe, in the Pacific, naval power plays a huge difference, and sea power plays a huge difference in Europe up until April of 1943, when the Allies won the sea war. But the aircraft just tends to dominate, particularly over time, what is going on in the pre-battlefield stage of the war. That more than anything else, it was air power that determined the course of that war. It distorted production, what I talked about, and in many ways, just one, basically the investment that all sides have to put into anti-air as the war goes on skyrockets out of all proportion. So the Germans are building and arming anti-air systems by the end of the war than they're actually building in tanks. So they're desperate to try and protect German cities. And the amount of ammunition that anti-air consumes, by the way, we're seeing this in Ukraine today. Kind of the same issues that come up in the Second World War in terms of anti-air ammunition consumption and production are appearing now. Because once you have them, you can never have enough when it comes to anti-air ammunition. And so these are ones I talked about. It's hard to underestimate. Went into it. Things like 4-inch bombers, atomic bombs, and rockets. Now, let's go through some examples of, I'm trying to pick one or two examples to talk about how air power works to shape the war before we get to the battlefield. And that's one of the arguments about how the war was won. By focusing on the battles, we miss this entire pre-story, which is in many ways far more important and far more definitive than what was on. Well, pre-production, the key thing is to stop the movement of raw materials. Now, this is one of those where you don't think about it a lot because it can't be measured in an easy output. But if you can stop raw materials getting to a factory, or indeed stop the factory from operating by cutting its power, you are limiting production. Right? To make production, things have to work. They have to get the materials. So one of the most effective ways you can do that is to keep raw materials from reaching the factories or to keep the factories from functioning by depriving them of power. And one of the key things is basically fossil fuels. Now this is where air and sea power work, you might say, in combination for Japan, though it's primarily air power for Germany. What a huge amount of effort goes into the air war is trying to deprive Germany of fuel. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. Right? So again, it takes time for these things to work. But one of the most effective is actually the distortion of Germany's fuel system and its coal delivery system. Now, you've probably not read a lot about coal delivery, and I don't expect you to, but there's a really good historian called Majersky who wrote a book about the sort of collapse of the German coal network in 1944, and they basically couldn't power any factories because they couldn't get coal around the system. And it was really because the German railway system was being shut down. Yeah.
So was it actually German coal that couldn't get into German factories?
German coal couldn't get to German factories. So they just couldn't, you couldn't move things around. For the Japanese, it's even more cataclysmic earlier because they get cut off from their fuel supplies. That when you look at the start of the Second World War for the United States, it happens because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. which all Americans heard about, but I assume you've heard about Pearl Harbor. The Americans basically forced the Japanese to attack them. So that wasn't what Roosevelt was thinking, because they embargo oil on Japan. Japan has no oil. All right, it's actually Japan is an astonishing economic story, because Japan has no resources beyond rice. It actually has very little in the way of the raw materials we normally think a state needs to flourish economically. Japan has little coal, it has little steel, it has little fuel, little oil. So the Japanese needed to get fuel to keep their economy alive. Before 1941, actually, they got most of their fuel from the United States. The United States was the Saudi Arabia of the world, the Middle East of the world, up until the Second World War. It produced far more fuel than anyone else, far more oil. So when the U.S. embargoes oil on Japan in 1941, they really have put a gun, an economic gun to Japan's head. And what they say to the Japanese, if you don't do what we want you to do, and by the way, it goes down to China and sort of Vietnam and the French Empire are real. Those are the things they're fighting over, but basically the United States wants the Japanese to pull out. If you don't do what we want you to do, your economy is going to collapse. So the Japanese go to war because they're not going to get fuel from the United States. They have to get fuel from the only other source in the Pacific at that time near them. And near is a relative phrase, and that's what we now call Indonesia, which you might know is the Dutch East Indies. So the Dutch Empire actually has the greatest fuel supplies in the Pacific in that period. And the Japanese, when they attack Pearl Harbor, they're attacking the American Navy not because they want to go to California. They want to neutralize the American Navy so they can go down to Indonesia. That's the whole way the war starts. And for the first few years of the war, the Japanese are, you say, full of oil. They basically capture all the fuel intact in the Dutch East Indies. But then, by 43 onwards, in one of the most devastating pre-production, they slowly lose access to that oil. Basically, a combination of aircraft, submarines, and carriers start throttling the Japanese ability to get oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan itself, and that starves Japanese production. It starts mobility throughout the economy, so that the Japanese economy starts producing far less than actually could produce as the fuel runs. And by the way, it affects the military as well. The military loses the ability to sort of do large sweeping movements. So that's one example. If you look at fossil fuels, you can make a huge difference by limiting or distorting the supply. Now, production, that phase that I talked about yesterday, which is actually, you might say, the factory stage, the assembly stage of the equipment. These are direct attacks. These were, by the way, what most people thought air power would be effective at doing. Though it's arguable to say that this was less effective than the pre-production or the deployment impact. But basically, if you can hit a factory, the hope was you could put it out of business. And the Americans and the British spend a lot of time thinking, okay, let's find a factory or group of factories that make a certain commodity. If we can take that commodity out, then we will be able to triple their economy. The British give up on that a large time by 1942, early 1943. They think it's very hard to hit anything accurately enough to take out factories, and they switch to the bombing of cities. So they go into, you might say that's entirely a pre-production. They're trying to kill workers. It's basically a campaign to destroy German cities, which is a way to try to destroy both German morale, but also German production by making their entire economy unable to function. It oddly is probably the least effective of the campaign. It's far less effective. The Americans keep trying to hit specific factories for a long time out there because they're more devoted to this idea of precision bombing, and they try to come during the day. The British, they say by 43, it's too dangerous to fly over Germany during the day. And that's because of all the things we talked about. Germans start building a lot of fighters, it's a lot of anti-air. It becomes very, very deadly for the British to fly over the day, and they say, forget about it. We're just going to fly at night and drop bombs. But the Americans keep doing it And what they do is they try to find, you might say, the silver bullets in the German economy, and they almost always fail. The most famous is probably the ball bearing campaign. I don't know if people, you probably are not excited by ball bearings, right? Well, maybe you're excited by ball bearings. It's a short ball. Ball bearings are very small balls of metal, but every vehicle you have is full of ball bearings. You could not have a vehicle without ball bearings. Because ball bearings actually make things move. How things operate. And the Americans come up with conceptually not a bad idea. If we can take out the German ability to make ball bearings, we will cripple their entire economy. Problem is, it's actually really hard to do. So actually, they do a number of raids on these ball bearing plants, but the Germans have them so well defended that the Americans lose catastrophic rates. If you want to say that the most dangerous service for the Americans in the Second World War, it's flying over Germany in a bomber in 1943. This is one raid, the famous raid on the sort of Schweinfurt ball bearing raids. They have a 17% loss rate in one raid. Which, if you were supposed to do 20 raids, count your own. Right? So yeah, that's sort of the kind of thing they were up against. So it does work at times in 43, 44. By 44, it works only in a larger sense, really, when they start really hitting the fossil fuels and the fuel production. So production, it has some effect, but I would argue it's more of a distorting impact in that it forces the Germans to invest so much to protect the factories. So, and it probably limits the increases the Germans could do. And then there's the deployment stage, when you go from the factories to the front. This, as I tried to say yesterday, has massive direct and indirect impacts. That the air war just distorts everything in the deployment phase. I discussed aircraft deployment yesterday, and that was really the Germans and Japanese are losing far more aircraft in the deployment stage than in battle by 43, 44. That simply they have pilots that aren't trained, they don't have spare parts, all of that comes into play. But there are other things that go into the deployment stage. One of the most difficult, if you want to say from the German perspective, is what happens when they try to deploy in France in 1944. The Americans start a campaign a few months before D-Day called the Transportation Campaign. Has anyone been to the lovely Loire Valley lately? Go to the Loire and try to find me a bridge built before 1944. No, honestly, no. You will not find a bridge over the Loire that has been standing since before 1944. And that is because they methodically take out every bridge across the Loire. They take across almost every bridge across the Seine. So finding old bridges in France outside of Lake Beauvais in Paris is really hard to do because they simply sever them all. And they sever all the railway lines as well. So again, you might not be a real railway nerd, but maybe there's a huge sort of railway switching yard in Le Mans, which is very important for the Normandy campaign and the whole thing. And that pays huge dividends when the campaign starts, because the Germans simply cannot get troops to Normandy. The whole German campaign was based on the fact that we wait to see where the Allies land, when we rush a lot to the beaches. We should be able to do it faster than the British and the Americans, because we can use trains, and they're going to have to use ships, and trains are more efficient. But actually, they lose all the advantage of the trains, and they have to proceed by road. So you would have German troops having to march 400 or 500 miles. So certain divisions that should have been there in 2 days take 30 days to reach the 2-day battle. And that's just one example of the kind of kind of deployment impact the air campaign can have.
Which one was this picture from?
That's a German bridge, so it's
That's good? Yeah.
I don't know, but it's basically another example of the transportation campaign, taking bridges down. That's probably the most, that's a railway bridge. They would go for the railway bridges, and they would take them down wherever they could. So that's a German one. I don't know where that is. I do know I can find out exactly where it is.
Sorry, just a statistic for the ball-bearing campaign. Did you
Yeah.
say the loss was 17 or 17?
17%, 17.5 in the first Schweinfurt raid.
Doesn't sound like that much, obviously. So that's still an 83% survival.
Well, again, if you have a 20, if you have to do 20 raids,
Yeah, can I?
that the average American bomber was supposed to do 20 raids, and then he would be done.
Right.
Okay, and they have to actually end that because too many people died, and they step back. By 1944, the second half, it's actually very safe to fly, so they increased the raid number to 30. But flying in 43 is really dangerous. So overall, when you look at particularly the strategic bombing campaign, and that is this campaign away from the battlefield to effect pre-production, production, and deployment of German forces, I would argue, and I tried to show in the book a number of times, it is by far the largest campaign in the war. It's often seen as a failure. It's presented as a failure based specifically on German production, and yet it ends up determining the outcome of the war by destroying more production than anything else and distorting the way production is made. Partly, as I say, to the point that air power people made themselves a bit too clever. They ran the most brilliant propaganda campaign, and they had probably the greatest filmmaker of propaganda in the world, Walt Disney helped them. You can go on YouTube now, well not now, but after the lecture, and look for a film called Victory Through the Air, Victory by Air Power. It is a Walt Disney, it's absolutely brilliant, high quality at the time, production of early 40s, 41, 42, arguing the United States can win the war through the air. Won't have to suffer a casualty. We'll just build these bombers and flatten the Japanese and the Germans, and that would be how the war is over. It didn't work like that. They basically made it sound too clinical, too easy to do, and Walt Disney made too effective a film in Victory Through Air Power. But actually, by judged by that standard, it didn't work. But judged by every other standard, the argument I would say is that air power plays the defining moment, and when it comes to production, far more German is destroyed in different ways through the air campaign than it's ever destroyed in the battlefield. You'd be surprised how little German production is destroyed in the battlefield. Again, the first figure I gave yesterday, in 1943, tanks are about 6% of German production. They build 11,000 tanks, the Germans lose 350. So you boil it all down, the impact of Kursk is 0.02 of 1% of German production. And I can go through, I don't want to get too far behind, but I can go through these different points later. And it also determines the outcomes of the battle. So not only does the strategic air campaign destroy and distort so much production, what it does eventually is determine how the land war works out. This goes back to something that I talked about yesterday. Basically, it forces the Germans, that might be a little better visually, a little bit larger, it forces the Germans to take their aircraft out of the land. The Germans have to strip, March of 43 onwards, they basically send all the fighters to Germany, because they can't afford to have any over the battlefield. And that puts the German army at a massive disadvantage for the rest of the war. It never fights with air superiority, or even contested air. It cannot fight with contested air at any time after the summer of 1943. Kursk is maybe the last time they get it. They contest air power. But after that, it's it, because they don't have any fighters on the Eastern Front. And even those fighters they deploy to the Eastern Front have the deployment problems I talked about. They're often not functional. So going back to that, it determines the outcome of the war. It progressively freezes the German army in place, causes a cascading spiral of losses. So in fact, if you look at German losses in 44, they're about 4 to 5 times in terms of soldiers' losses as 42. German losses are just staggering. They lose more, I think, in 45 than they actually lose in all of 43. So German losses, it's not like you have a steady state. German losses accelerate massively as the war goes on. And I would argue they accelerate massively because their troops have no air power. They are fighting basically a war where their enemies have air power. And the Western Front, this is a phrase, by the way, I'm going to talk about. The Western Front in particular becomes a transparent front. The Americans and the British can, if the weather is useful, plays ball, they can actually find the soldiers. The Germans have great difficulty hiding on the Western Front, unless the weather plays ball. So they have here, the famous one is they can only launch the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, praying to the weather gods. The entire Battle of the Bulge is based on the weather being helpful to the Germans. It's actually strategically known. It's a crazy way to launch a battle. We know that this battle is only possible if we have bad weather for a few weeks. And it works exactly as you would expect. They do have a few days of bad weather. They're able to make advances at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge from December 16th until about the 24th, 25th, Christmas. Skies clear. And what happens when the skies clear in the Battle of the Bulge? The German army stops dead. It cannot advance when the skies clear. That's Allied air power. And I think that gives you an example of the kind of war and the way air power is shaping what does not happen.
Question.
Yeah.
Does Göring don't take responsibility in this?
I mean, Göring's problem is part of Göring is actually a rational realist. The problem is people who talk to Göring outside Hitler's presence often said he knew Germany had lost the war by 41, which is why he descended into drug taking and sort of opulent, indulgent living. I mean, Göring lives in Karen Hall and bathes in jewels and eats the finest food, partly because he knows, part of him knows that this war's over and he's going to be a dead man. So he becomes dysfunctional and a bit of a drug addict. However, when he's around Hitler, he cannot speak bad because he doesn't have enough personal ability to resist Hitler, so he makes the most ridiculous promises. Probably the most interesting, I'll talk about it, this is promise, oh, I can supply Stalingrad from the air. No one can supply Stalingrad from the air in winter, but he promises it to Hitler because Hitler wants him. And actually it makes everything worse. Stalingrad is a classic example of it. And I will talk about it tomorrow. Stalingrad is a logistical thing because they can't actually get supplies through. And Hitler wants not to retreat. Most of the army wants to retreat. They said logistically we can't do it. But Göring says, no, my Führer, I will get the supplies in by air, knowing actually there's no way. And that's why the German Sixth Army has no chance, because they couldn't fly it in. So Göring is really odd, because he's probably the Nazi leader with the greatest grasp of the reality of Germany's situation. He was also one who didn't want to go to war in 1939. Göring was supposedly skeptical about the invasion, but he simply can't. He can't exist. So I mean, he's a psychopathic, pathetic figure. Might be the way you would describe him on that. So he makes ridiculous. But yeah, he's the one on the battle of the Bulge. Oh yes, we will. And they build up huge numbers of fighters, 1,000 fighters. His production, they were still producing, but then he would send 1,000 fighters flown by people who maybe had 10 hours in the cockpit because they had no fuel to train. And so he would send them to mass formations and just get massive battles. So, but now let's turn to the next part of the lecture, to where we are now, and talk about similarities and differences with how air power has been working for the last 2 years. And by the way, is continuing to work in an incredibly dynamic environment. That's one thing that, of course, people forget when they look at war, is in a very short period of time, wars become very different beasts than you expect them to be. So when you look at 1939, and you look at 1943, 44, the aircraft are so much more capable. Really, in 1939, British are still flying biplanes from their aircraft carriers. They're flying planes closer to the Red Baron of aircraft. These are still very simple, primitive aircraft that are being flown. But by 1943, 44, you're flying up jet planes, you have four-engine bombers, you have V-2 rockets, you just have air power having gone down the kinds of roads that technologically, without a war, would have taken 15 years. It would have taken, it accelerates. We are, I would say, seeing something quite similar now in Ukraine, particularly with UAV. Right? That this is being, the war is forcing, because of the air war we're seeing, it is forcing the kind of technological adaptation that would have taken a lot longer. So the way air power was perceived to operate in January, February of 2022, before the invasion, bears very little resemblance to the air power we see now, because it is going down. But again, if we go down to what I tried to talk about a little bit yesterday, how was air power supposed to work? It was supposed to be, for the Russians, fast, clinical, and decisive, based on two primary elements of air power: fixed-wing aircraft and missiles. So fixed-wing aircraft and sort of cruise missiles. Cruise missiles could all be fired by ship, by plane, or other systems were supposed to be so accurate and so devastating, and the Ukrainians were not supposed to have a counter to them, that air power was supposed to be, in many ways, the crippling weapon to start with. The Russians would use air power to basically disassemble Ukraine's military, break it up into units, and then the land forces would come storming through. So as I say, in the last, and again, very quick period of time, hours and days, how it's being talked about, the result would be that air power would, in a sense, open the door. Air power would be this quick, decisive, powerful influence, allowing for the breakthroughs, and Russian forces then making very fast, deep advances, very much in a late World War II kind of picture. It's very similar to, say, what the Allies and the Russians were doing in 44 when they could get their big advances. It's supposed to be quite similar. They would both gain control of the air, the Germans would become immobilized, cut off, and then the Allies would have breakthroughs, and their tanks move down the road very fast, making a great deal of difference. And this would, for the Germans, force them into for the Ukrainians, the result would be they would be forced into the cities, and they would be forced into the countryside in desperate attempts to find places where air power couldn't reach them. Realism attempt to do that. Well, the reality, of course, was very, very different in how air power functioned in the war. One, it was not nearly as dominant as people expected. It was unable, one, it wasn't nearly as accurate. I think that's incredibly important. That they had overstated the accuracy of Russian systems. That even Russian cruise missiles that got through had a much lower hit rate than they were expecting. So the accuracy, but more importantly, I think, is just the ability of the Russians to fly over the battlefield was significantly limited. And that's because people had forgot to really judge the most important step of air power. And that is one that you might not know. I'm sorry if I'm going to use quite technical phrases here. This is the U.S. Air Force phrase. They had forgotten about suppression of enemy air defense at sea. You saw almost no discussion of suppression of enemy air defense in this war early, because the assumption was the Ukrainians simply wouldn't present enough of an anti-air threat to stop the Russians. So very little, and we have these phrases, all these studies saying the Russians would overwhelm the Ukrainians from the air. The assumption was that Ukrainian anti-air defense would, in some, not be functional enough to see off Russian fixed-wing aircraft. Again, it's one of those weird assumptions that seem to influence the pre-February 24th analysis of military power, because C is really hard to do. The U.S. Air Force spends more time flying suppression of enemy air defense than any other mission. That's what it is. That the U.S. Air Force will not operate in an environment where they have not suppressed enemy air defense because it will be too dangerous. So what the U.S. Air Force will do first and foremost is trying to get rid of enemy air defense. This was something that had been missing from the analysis going into the war. In the Second World War, it's extremely important that when we look at the bombing of Germany, which becomes, 43 struggles, 44 becomes quite devastating. The difference between 43 and 44 is C. In 43, you cannot suppress enemy air defenses, so the bombers are often flying unescorted over German cities. German fighters can come up and massacre. By 1944, you have the Mustang, which can now suppress German fighters. You can go ahead and suppress enemy air defenses, allowing the bombers to get farther into Germany. So C arguably determines the success of the bombing missions in Europe. But that had sort of been forgotten by that time. And it will be because one example, which I think is the one that is talked about before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as showing sort of what will matter, is the Syrian example. The Russians had used air power considerably in Syria, 2016 onwards. Basically, they come to support the Assad regime. They deploy a lot of their best aircraft, most advanced aircraft, and they bomb the hell out of Assad's opposition. They drop a lot of ordnance on Syria, and they kill a lot of people. And it is seen, by the way, as a key example of Assad, why Assad stays in power. If you go back to 2016-15, Assad seems to be on the ropes. And the assumption is Assad is not going to last. He's going to be overthrown. But in many ways, it's the Russian insertion of air power that is seen as absolutely vital for saving Assad and allowing Assad to not only recover, but extend his power. And Assad is there today. And so you often see writings that what Syria has done is given the Russians, and this is the phrase, regularly battle-tested. It's battle-tested air power because of Syria. The only issue is no one of the Syrians the Russians were fighting could fire back. They lack anti-air. So the Russians were able to drop a bomb on anything in Syria from complete safety. There was no anti-air systems in the Syrian opposition. So far from being battle-tested, actually, because the Russians didn't have to do suppression of enemy air defense, I think it made Russian air power worse. It's a bit like training for a boxing match and tell the person you're training with they can't punch back. Right? You knock them out all the time, you think you're a great boxer, but actually you have no training in how to fight. And the Russian Air Force had no training in how to fight when it had competent enemy air defenses. And by the way, not only was it competent, it's competent on both sides, and in many ways, the sea problem has determined the fixed-wing air war now. That it is very, very dangerous to fly for both sides over the battlefield, and getting increasingly so. That the air defense systems are indeed getting better and more efficient, and neither side can appear much near the front line at any time. So most aircraft, actually in this war, are staying a long way on both sides from the front lines. What they do in the case, they get as close as they can, but stay out of air defense range, and drop an ordnance that is either a glide bomb or a cruise missile, which will go into the battle area. But they're staying outside. For the Ukrainians, their big system that's allowed them to do that is the Patriot. Even though they have only a small number of these Patriot batteries, basically the Russians, if you watch the flight maps, have marked out in their own mind where the Patriots can reach. And they will not, unless it's such a high priority mission, they feel they have to take the risk. They will not fly in Patriot range. They will stay away from the front because of that. But also, the Russians are doing the same with their S-400s and S-300s. That they have very efficient, they are quite efficient by air system. And the Ukrainians are also not flying very close to the line, because the odds of the plane getting destroyed are simply too high. They're I would say it's far higher than even 1943 with the bomber over Schweinfurt. If you're going to fly within anti-air system range, certainly if you're going to fly within the Patriot system range and the Patriot fires at you, you have well more than 50% chance of being shot at. And with Russian systems, it's not that much lower. So we have to be very careful. That is what's determining fixed wing. So the real technological race is not to make aircraft that can survive, because they can't survive anti-air. It's to give aircraft systems that can fire outside of the range. So you're trying to come up with things that aircraft can use without getting too close. The big development I mentioned before in the last 6 months has been glide bombs. And glide bombs are very cheap. They basically take old ordnance and put pins on it. It's quite a simple system. But they can release them 100 miles back from the line and guide them like that. Guidable bombs. But that's a way of determining it. On the other hand, what that means is you don't see aircraft. You cannot do what people thought, which would have aircraft over the field of battle. The journalism was that both sides, certainly the Russians would try to be flying over the battle, seeing targets and taking them out. That is impossible with fixed-wing aircraft. The kind of tactical air power we saw in the Second World War is simply not possible. The aircraft will not survive. I know, so there's the sort of glide bombs, that's how you're maintaining viability. People have asked about the F-16s, we were talking about them earlier. All I'll say is don't get your hopes up too much, because F-16s, they are better aircraft than the Ukrainians have had before. So they will be more capable aircraft, but they will still come into the fact that if they're tracked by a modern air system, they could be in trouble. So what they will do is potentially give the Ukrainians a few extra seconds close to the line, so they can at least go a little farther. They will play a role in scaring off some Russian fixed-wing aircraft. So maybe Russian fixed-wing aircraft themselves will stay a little farther back, but they will not be changing the course of this war. F-16 is still an old technology. It's 2 generations behind what the Americans are behind. So we have to put that. Fixed wings are there, they are effective in certain things, they are developing new technologies, but they also have massive issues with survivability. And this means that we have to look at something similar, the strategic air power discussion on this war, and compare it to the Second World War. There is a strategic air and I would argue strategic sea power very much going on in this war, and both sides are waging it. And it has some very mixed results. It's one of those to see the true impact of air and sea and strategic warfare in the Ukrainian war. We probably won't know afterwards. We have certain campaigns that seem to be quite effective and certain campaigns that don't. The Russians have launched 2 winters of strategic attacks. Right? And they've used a lot of their most expensive missiles, and now they use a lot of Shaheeds. And by the way, that's another interesting thing of the war. The cost differential between an effective expensive system and an effective cheap system isn't as, i.e. the effectiveness is not good enough to justify the very expensive. So the Russians have some hyper expensive Kinzhals and caliber missiles, but they can't really do much more than the Shaheeds in terms of effect, because the Russians can send a lot of Shaheeds over. Now, we don't know, and I don't want to judge the Russian strategic campaign so far. I think we could judge the first one, which was the winter of 2022-2023. There was a definite Russian strategic air campaign, mostly missiles, and that was against Ukrainian power generation. Very similar to some of the things we're talking about in the Second World War. You're trying to shut the Ukrainian power system down. We don't know if they were doing it try and damage war industry. More likely, it seemed to be they were trying to damage Ukrainian morale. They were trying to freeze the Ukrainians and destroy that. What that showed is, I think, the real difficulty in strategic air power. They simply didn't have enough to do it. Again, people think it's much easier to do a strategic air campaign. The Russians simply didn't have the material to keep the campaign. You need everything to work. You need massive amounts of material to keep coming back day after day. It's never going to be one day. Things can get fixed. And you need the intelligence to be able to tell you you're hitting the right targets. And the Russians simply couldn't shut down the Ukrainian power system. Supposedly there were a few very dicey days when there were power outages. Cities were suffering, but at no point was the power shut, lost the grid. And so that was one which cost a lot and gained very little. They changed their focus this winter. That people thought they might come back for the power system. They actually haven't come back for the power system this winter. They've been trying to go for Ukrainian war production. So that's been the goal of, again, very similar to the Second World War. They're now trying to go for Ukrainian production in different ways. So people were saying there were all these missile raids and drone raids. Why are the lights not going off? It's because the Russians aren't trying to turn the lights on. They are trying to get production. All I will say is we don't know how this has worked or not. The Ukrainians are not telling us. Okay? So we don't know. And I don't want to judge it. But that campaign has been ongoing. And it continues to be ongoing. And that's what, when you hear this campaign, now mostly these Shahid drones, that's what they're aiming at. They're now waging a strategic air campaign against Ukrainian production. And they continue, by the way, to run a strategic air campaign against Ukrainian morale. The attacks on places like Odessa are simply attacks to try and crack Ukrainian morale, like very similar to British attacks in Germany. Now, the Ukrainians have also launched a strategic campaign. There is the one at sea, and I think that has to be mentioned, because it's probably the single most successful strategic campaign of the war. We talk about the war as deadlock often, is it deadlock or not? And on land, there does seem to be very small advances and very difficult to make sort of changes in the line. The war at sea has been entirely different from that. The war at sea was actually almost an afterthought before February 24th. The assumption was the war at sea would last about 10 minutes. Ukrainians had one ship. And they had one ship. And by the way, the Russians took out that one more ship in the first day. So the Ukrainians had one more ship, the Russians took it out. The assumption was to get
if I'm mistaken, it was sunk down by Ukrainians themselves.
Yeah. But that's because the Russians were going to try and save it.
Yeah.
It was scuttled, and at that point everyone thought, okay, naval war's over. Right? The Russians control the Black Sea, they have the Black Sea fleet, which had been built up before the invasion to be quite a large and powerful force. And that Ukraine would be shut off. The Russians start a blockade of Ukrainian grain. They can't ship it out of Odessa. You cannot ship that much grain. Anyone who's been to Ukraine will tell you, my God, Ukraine produces a lot of grain. I mean, it just produces epic. I think the Black Earth is real. You see the grain production. There's no way you can ship that amount of grain out by rail. You just can't do it. You're going to have to ship it out by sea. And the assumption was Ukraine would lose that. That was it. The war was over economically for Ukrainian grain. But then what they've done is raised this extraordinarily successful strategic campaign in the Black Sea, using a combination of sea drones with air drones and missiles, so completely unmanned, right? Almost completely unpiloted, with very few human beings actually taking part in the action. They have destroyed about a quarter of the Black Sea fleet. They have sunk more ships than any navy since the Japanese in the Second World War. Actually, Russian naval losses are larger than any fleet since the Second World War. They have pushed the Russian Navy out of Crimea. They occasionally would try to get a ship in with the Ukrainian occupation. And the Ukrainians are now shipping more grain out of Odessa than they shipped before the war started.
It's a percentage
that
they have been more successful than the most successful.
No, I mean, in terms of, by any standard, I mean, in terms of what they're able to ship out of Odessa, by the damage they've done to the Russian Navy.
Because it's like 14 ships.
Yeah, which is a lot. These are simply the flagship of the fleet. And, you add 14 ships is a lot for a modern fleet. I mean, the whole Russian Navy is probably 20% of the entire Russian surface fleet. Most of the Russian surface fleet, their specific fleet, is the Black Sea fleet, and there's submarines up north. It'd be interesting to see. I'd be surprised if the Russians had them. It's a significant percentage.
Excuse me?
So that campaign has gone on, and that is an example. Yeah.
So that they're shipping more grain out of Odessa,
Odessa
so
now.
by sea and by land, than before the war started.
Yeah.
And that's without this,
From Odessa.
without a cobbled up agreement of safe
Yes.
passage.
The Russians can't attack Ukraine. I mean, I don't know how dirty you want to get. The Russians only have a small window because what the ships do is they run from Odessa to Romanian waters.
Yes.
And once they're in Romanian waters, the Russians will not attack them. That's NATO power. So really the ships have a relatively small gauntlet to run to get to Romanian waters. And the Russians simply are too far away to get the ship. I mean, their only option would be to throw anti-ship missiles and sink merchant ships. And that's probably not a very wise thing to do. Because those aren't going to be Ukrainian sailors. They're going to be, most sailors are from the global south, which is quite sympathetic to Russia. So they'd be sinking people who come from states that have some sympathy for their cause. So this has been a very successful strategy. The other thing that is ongoing, which has received a lot of coverage in the last few days, is the Ukrainians are running a pre-production campaign. And that is primarily to attack Russian oil refineries. They are running a significant, and I'm going to talk about that. What they're doing with that is they're using UAVs. And that's the last thing I'm going to talk about, and then I'll end and we can have more questions. The real issue we have is to what degree are UAVs changing air power and changing the way we look at it. What can expect it to be and fund it and devise it. When it comes to the Ukrainians, simply fixed-wing aircraft, they don't have good enough to survive. They were never going to fly over Russia. But what they started to do is develop different systems to fly over Russia with unpiloted. That one is actually, that model that we see now, there is the one they're using in the present strategic. That was the Russian version. The Russians released that drone as attacking the Russian. That is what we can tell a completely homegrown Ukrainian system. So, I mean, it might have had technology. They're working with the British. The British are providing a lot of drone support, but the Ukrainians are doing a homegrown drone program. Partly they started it early because the United States said you can't use any of our weapons to attack inside Russia. So the Ukrainians have to attack inside Russia, and they're lining the Ukrainian systems. So you have UAVs proliferating to these, in some ways, still quite simple, we say advanced ones, which are now coming out in more and more numbers. What we're going to see, in fact, in 2024, is a growing strategic air campaign on either side as the number of drones explode. So Ukrainians have produced those. The Russians are now building, under license, the Iranian Shaheeds, and they're producing them in very large numbers as well. So basically, you're going to have, before you might have 5 or 10 drones in a raid. By the summer or later, you will have hundreds of drones that will be operating in these ways. Maybe thousands. We don't know. And that's going to be a huge problem because an anti-air system is very good at shooting down anything, but it's very hard to shoot down thousands. And you can't use your really good systems to do it because your really good systems cost more than the drone. So this is an exquisite system, the Patriot. Brilliant missile. Shoot down anything in the world. That costs, I think, $2 to $3 million a missile. That example, probably $10,000. Go do the math. On the other hand, you're also going to see hundreds of thousands of these kinds of things during the war. That is a more, I would argue, tactical kind of weapon. Again, both sides, very simple drones, and what they've done is made the battlefield more transparent than even the Second World War. You can't hide on this battle. If you're out in the open, you will be seen by one of those damn things very, very quickly. And what has happened is neither side has been able to mass armored movements. The whole idea of armored warfare is you have mass. You create a sort of fist, armored fist that can break through and go down the road. To do that, you have to master them, to bring them together and have them operate. That is an impossibility because the second they come out of cover, they are spotted within minutes. And you can get long-range artillery fire on them. So we have not seen a single armored breakthrough in this war, with one exception, the Ukrainians attacking Mardi, and that's because there were no Russians. The Ukrainians basically hit an area. But we've not seen anywhere since then an actual armed breakthrough and escalation. And we have seen, on the other hand, historic armor losses. So I think we have to admit what we're seeing. We are seeing the destruction of vehicles on an unprecedented scale. The Russians have lost somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 tanks. About 3,000 is sort of graphically proven. The Ukrainians say 6. That's probably a little high, but somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 are Russian tanks. And the line, I tried to actually write a piece on it, has moved less in the last year than the Western Front in 1960. The Battle of Avdiivka, which just ended, took months. The Russian advance was about 8 or 9 months. That matches exactly the Battle of the Sun. That's what we're talking about. We are talking about First World War advances. And why that is the advances that are being done now are advances on foot. They are not advances by people. Cannot have a survival. So what is air power doing? What is UAVs? I'm not going to answer that, but they are presenting the real question. And I think the answers we're going to see about air war, or a lot of it is going to come out of this technology going forward. But they are doing, or trying to do on both sides, many of the things we saw in the Second World War. They're trying to do strategic bombing, they're trying to do battlefield prediction, they're trying to do suppression of enemy aircraft. So the principles of air war are basically the same. But it's a question of whether you can technology. I will shut up now because I probably talked way too long, but I'm happy to take some questions.
If the war is really conventional, then no worries. But if, and I think we know that, Mr. Putin knows that by conventional means he has no chance to win the war.
Yeah.
He's going to use other means to reach his goals. So, shouldn't we more invest into, for instance, the American election campaign to have a chance to win the war? Because if Donald Trump is elected, maybe Putin has a chance.
You come on Thursday? Because this is one thing said, where has the book failed? How the war was won has failed? Is it completely overlooks information warfare? Because I don't think it was important. Basically, people try to run propaganda campaigns and change people's minds. They never work. That we don't weaken German morale, the Germans don't weaken British morale, the Americans don't weaken Japanese morale, the Japanese don't weaken American. It just doesn't work. These information warfare. So I have become very cynical about them. That considering the amount of effort and the amount of talk about them, they didn't seem to work. However, boy, am I wrong when we look at this. Something has happened, and I don't know if it's technology has allowed the transmission of ideas that are more effective than Second World War ideas, but something has happened to make information warfare really effective. And I would say in the Russian case, far more effective has been information warfare than actual battlefield. But I'm trying to talk about that.
Looking at the NATO campaign in Black Sea, isn't the conclusion that the days of big warships, of military navies are simply over? Which military power could still afford to sail ships on sea, sail very expensive ships on the seas with hundreds of crew on it, with a single unmanned naval drone can sink it.
I have to say, I was wrong on information warfare. I was right on this. I wrote an article in the Atlantic in May of 2022. I got a lot of stick on it because I said tanks and large warships are heading towards obsolescence if they can't be repaired. And it seemed to me that both were able to, it's a cost differential. You can destroy something really big and expensive with something small and cheap. The big and expensive doesn't have a future. It really just doesn't work. And when I wrote that, I got all the, tanks are awesome. Tanks are, I play World with tanks. You know, I can do this. And warships look so great. Look at the guns. And I got a lot of stick for it, but I think it was fundamentally right. Now, what I'm told by, say, the U.S. we protect Russia. So there's a lot of, the Russians can't do it. All right. I still am skeptical. I'm more skeptical about large warships because of the number of anti-ship missiles they would see in a campaign, which we're not seeing so much of, because the Ukrainians just have a homegrown, very simple anti-ship missile, and the Russians never come close enough to allow the Ukrainians to use it anymore. That's where they sunk the Mossad stuff, was sunk by Ukrainian anti-ship missile. But if you had a war with the Chinese and the Americans at sea, it would be a bloodbath of ships because of the anti-ship missiles. But they'd fill the air, and you could actually do quite simple calculations. Go to a large warship and say, okay, how many anti-ship missiles can you engage? You know, if you fire all your ordnance. Well, we can engage 40 over an hour. Okay, what happens when the 41st gets you? Well, 41 anti-ship missiles cost a hell of a lot less than warship. So you can see how that's going to go. So I don't want to say that they're coming out of their ass. Maybe they will be able to defend better. But as long as you can have cheaper things, they can destroy expensive things, the cheaper things will have. We're seeing a bit of an example of that, interestingly, in what's going on off the Red Sea now. The Houthis are throwing up very primitive, simple systems. And the U.S. is shooting them down with the most expensive, exquisite military technology. So each Houthi piece of equipment might cost $1,000. The Americans are shooting it down with far more expensive than Patriot systems. Many millions. That can't continue. The U.S. would actually run out of those systems fighting Houthis if this went on for a year.
In which case, to combat these cheap, anti-air missiles and stuff like that, why doesn't the US just simply develop cheap missiles?
Well, that's a very good question. They are trying. People, in many ways, the cheaper systems, like handhelds, are quite effective. The U.S. has not ever tended to go for cheap. If you deal with Pentagon, they love expensive. No. I mean, a lot of it's. I don't want to get out. If you want to talk about it at some point, the research project I'm doing on the failure to estimate the Russian military properly before February 24th, 2022. A lot of the failure to estimate, I think, came out of the think tank community that didn't want to lose Pentagon contracts. You don't want to write a report that says the Russian military's got a real corruption problem. We don't know if the equipment works really well. You don't need to panic about it. No one's going to write that report because that means the U.S. Department of Defense isn't able to go to Congress and say, we need these awesome missiles against these really scary Russian systems. So the system incentivizes research, which stresses threat. And if you stop doing that, then you're not going to get any comfort. So the whole think tank system is not always geared to have, you might say, honest research. It's geared to have research that will appeal to the client. And so I think, and that feeds the U.S. The phrase that's come into being now is exquisite. The U.S. prefers exquisite systems. Everything is highly manufactured and costs huge amounts of money and has a 99% hit rate, as opposed to a good enough, which costs 2% of the cost and has a 90%. So the U.S. prefers the exquisite. And even though they sometimes get it wrong, early in the war. I don't know if you heard about something called the Switchblade. The Switchblade was supposed to be the great weapon, the drone, basically an automated drone that would go and find a target and go on it. They performed really poorly, considering the huge amounts of money that had been invested.
And we haven't seen Switchblade 600, which they were supposed to.
That's what I've heard is they just don't work. I mean, right now they've not been able to work effectively, at least considering the huge amount of money that is going into. Maybe they're who knows, they could be fixing them, and soon we'll see them on the battlefield. But actually, so far, it's a Batman, which costs nothing. You buy a kit, and you can put that together, pre-made kit, just strap a camera to it, or strap ordnance. You could probably, that's it, $200. You could have, for the cost of the Switchblade, you could have 500 points, which is going to be more effective. But the U.S. doesn't like it.
Maybe two questions. The first one might be quick. Why didn't you talk about helicopters? Can you say one sentence? And the
Are
other,
they aircraft?
okay, yeah. And the other is, are we already seeing anti-drone drones, like maybe a drone with a machine gun? Will we have swarms of drones flying into each other?
This is going to be mayhem. There's going to be so many drones over the battlefield that I have no idea what's going to happen. There's going to be hundreds of thousands of these things. If one side can make an anti-drone technology, then it can have a huge advantage. There is an anti-drone technology, electronic warfare. And electronic warfare actually has been very effective, though they're coming up with some hardware. There's a constant technological struggle about electronic warfare. Most drones are, if they operate guiding on connection to GPS. So they're a bit like your phone. Right? And if you can sever, what a lot of electronic warfare does, is they sever that connection to GPS, or they sever that connection to the operator. Basically, it throws so much electronic chaff around the drone that the drone can't communicate, and then the drone basically dies. It can't talk. It doesn't know where it's going. In the extreme cases, the other side can actually take the drone over. Now, so far, they've produced enough drones, and electronic warfare has been effective, but often at quite close range, that drones are still making a difference. But who knows? One side develops a hardened drone against all electronic warfare, they'll have a massive advantage. If the other side develops a much better electronic warfare, and they can't be stopped, they'll have a massive advantage. As opposed to helicopters, it is interesting. Helicopters are not that survivable. The Ukrainian ones do not survive very well at all in the battlefield. And even the best Russian ones occasionally will topple and fire missiles and drop back. But the real change in Russian air power is with the glide bombs, which have been more effective than helicopters. So helicopters are one of those, they're going to be in real trouble going forward because of air defense getting better and better. Because helicopters are pretty slow. They're much slower than others. That's my opinion. Right? I didn't.
Yeah, I really like the materialist framework that you laid out yesterday. But I was wondering, you were talking about the high attrition rate of Russian tanks in Ukraine, and I've seen a few studies highlighting that part of that attrition rate is linked to the fact that Russian soldiers, once a Russian tank is hit by 84 or something like that, they flee, and then the drones come and destroy it.
Yeah.
And that's clearly an issue of morale, right?
Well, I mean, I don't want to die. It's not.
Yeah, but you don't have that
if
much
you're in
difference.
a disabled, well, I mean, if you're in a disabled tank, you're going to get the heck out of it. Because if you're in a disabled tank now, you are toast.
Yeah, but often they're not even disabled. They're just hit, and then the Russian troops flee, and then the drones come and destroy it, and they leave the tanks open.
Yeah,
Which is a problem.
you see amazing things where, like, one of those literally drops a hand grenade through the tank. Russian morale, I'm one of those, I don't like so anyone's morale is about to crack or not. That's an argument people make about work all the time, and I very rarely see it. I don't like to say morale is going to crack. It's not quantifiable. I actually very rarely see it happen. Yes, German morale probably cracked in 1918. It does occur. So arguably German morale cracked in 1918. But that was also because of a disastrous 6 months of military events. And the fact that the German people quite logically lost the faith that they had any chance of winning. So, as long as morale will crack if either side believes they cannot survive, then you're in real trouble. The second that people decide they can't win a war, morale goes. But right now, both sides seem to be fighting on the assumption they have a chance to win. So my guess is they probably will.
So if we come back on the slow landlines advances, so if I understood correctly, that's because of the UAVs and air power?
Oh, and artillery and mine. Basically, there are so many layers of systems that a vehicle has to traverse to go forward. And if you don't have one, you're going to get the other. And they're all cheaper, and they're all plentiful. And they all make it incredibly difficult for the vehicle to advance. So it's not just UAVs. They're the new one, but basically UAVs are added to what was already a very dangerous situation for tanks. Before the UAV became dominant in 2022, tank losses were massive. So the UAVs are just making it worse. But, I mean, if you look at just mines, then again, I don't want to get too specific on systems. Something that's been really effective is artillery spread mines. That's why it's very hard to imagine a column of vehicles advancing down the road. Because all you need are a few artillery shells which are packed with mines. They make them. You drop one in the front of the column, one in the back of the column, one on either side of the column. That column's going broken. It's basically been isolated by 4 shells. The Ukrainians did that a number of times last year. So, and there's so many things.
So what would be a good tactic to actually...
Not to attack, I'd like to say, anyone who attacks this year is doing a nice game. The Ukrainians have to do more of that. They have to build up range capability and weaken what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, logistics. The only way you can have a successful attack is to destroy another side's logistics. If you are going to attack a defended position now, the chance of failure is actually wrong. In fact, there hasn't been a success. I don't consider Avdiivka a strategic success to the Russians. So they lost 47,000 people to take a tiny town. That's not a success. So I haven't seen strategic successes on either side going forward. If I were the Ukrainians, and amazingly the Ukrainians asked me, I would not attack at all. I'd invite the Russians to please you come forward.
My question is, firstly, but what was the real role of the Soviet Union in World War II? And the second, it's more remark than interesting remark than question. It's very interesting because very interesting to note the factor of logistics in memoirs of Soviet General Meretskov, because despite of his love to this Soviet soldier that he were expressing in his on the pages of his memories, even he recognized that it wasn't the soldier who won the Battle of Stalingrad, but it was the Soviet industrial machine that for this 1 year could get the, I don't know how to say, could get the time to develop, to wide its production, and so on and so on.
The book, some people said, oh, you're insulting the Soviet Union. It's not insulting the Soviet Union. It's saying you can look at war in different ways. Mm-hmm. If you look at war in terms of infantry, yes, the Soviet Union is the dominant. If that's how you judge war, by numbers of infantry, the Soviet Union is by far, the Eastern Front is the dominant. It has more infantry on either side than any other front. If you look at it in terms of production and what things are made and where they're destroyed, the Eastern Front shrinks from being the largest to actually secondary. It gets 20 to 30% of total production, and it doesn't do any of the pre-production and deployment process. So I'm not trying to say that Eastern Front doesn't matter, but from the perspective I was trying to give it, or to give the war, it doesn't actually destroy that much German production. So I don't like when people say it's the biggest front. That to me is a very arguable definition. It's not by what I would consider the biggest front. Which, by the way, if you're going to use biggest, then you can say China is big power. They have a very large army. No one says China, and this is what's driving the war against Japan. So you have to be careful on how we judge it. Yeah, Soviet Union produces a lot of very serviceable equipment. And I think that, but also there's another thing to point out. The logistics part almost all comes from U.S. trucks. So the Soviet Army by 42, 43 is using mostly U.S. trucks to do the serious things. So they're getting a lot of logistic benefits from the U.S. Though they're using primarily Soviet training. There's really, if you want to study Soviet logistics, they're quite fascinating. They do an extraordinary job keeping the train lines going. So the Soviets do a very impressive logistic job on the train. Because until they start getting a lot of these kind of trucks, Soviet trucks aren't that good. So they have to get material as close as possible to the back of the line on the train. Because you don't want to go on a truck. But I will talk about that tomorrow, the truck train relationship. Sorry, this one.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I have two questions. The first one would be about the participation of Turkish drones. So at the beginning of the war, drones like Bayraktar was like one of the symbols of resistance. And right now, I mean, it's almost like they don't exist. There's no videos, no evidence of them being used. And the second question would be about the missiles. For some of the Russian missiles to be created, they have to use Western microchips and electronics. And why don't those Western countries just stop supplying these electronics to Russia?
People like making money. I'll answer the second question first. There are cutting-edge Western electronics appearing in Russian missiles that were fired this winter that were made in the fall of 2023. So missiles that were assembled just a few months ago are jam-packed with technology. We know that because the serial numbers in the Western technology show that they were manufactured. So the Russians are still getting a huge amount of advanced tech. Mostly it seems through Central Asia. So if you look at the trade flows, there's very little direct trade between the United States and Russia with the sanctions, but trade between Kazakhstan and Russia has gone up by 5%. And amazingly, trade between Germany and Kazakhstan has also gone up by 5%. Now that's not the Kazakhs buying a lot of German stuff. That's because the stuff is being all over. And that's because the sanctions are leaky and people like to make money. And in fact, they charge 2 or 3 times the cost of the components in Russia. So if you're going to have a sanction regime that works, you're going to have to get through all trade partners with Russia, and that has shown to be almost impossible. So what you can hope from sanctions is to limit Russian production. And that seems to be having some effect. The Russians can't actually expand production, and that a lot of that comes down to sanctions. But I think people have been far more interested in making money. A lot of people have been following the sanctions. When it comes to the Bayraktars, they're interesting. They were good. There was a song. They were very popular. They're still there. From what I understand, they're being used mostly as visual intelligence platforms a little farther back, because they're actually quite expensive compared to those. So a Bayraktar is a relatively expensive piece of equipment. The Ukrainians can't get them in mass quantities. So they're not going to have thousands of Bayraktars. And so it became a cost issue versus effect. It's far more easy to have thousands of those or even make your own version of that and use a biological. So they were very useful in 2022. They're just not survivable at the cost in 2024. They are being used, but they're not being used over the battlefield. But everywhere, that's one thing. Every drone manufacturer in the world is trying to give Ukraine drones. Because they want them to be used. There are American drone companies, I will not name which, that are desperate to give Ukraine drones. Because they want their drones to be used. The U.S. government will not allow them to transfer.
Could you please to explain more this logistics?
Tomorrow's logistics. No more logistics. We're going to do logistics tomorrow.
Because the same General Mereskov hinting on the Minister of Defense Timoshenko was saying that the chief problem, why one of the most of the key problems which caused the heavy hard defeats of Soviet troops from German, it was a very how to say very weak road system, because the Minister of Defense were doing nothing during the and Ministry of Defense of Soviet Union were doing nothing during the 20 years of interbellum.
I mean, logistics determine. I will talk about it.
I have one technical question and one bigger question. You just showed that it was relatively easy to take out all the bridges over the Loire and the Seine.
Well, it took months and huge amounts of effort.
Then why is it so difficult to damage the Kerch Bridge?
Well, I mean, modern bridge techniques, a lot of the bridges over the air bridges, and that they could fly aircraft over them all the time. So they could come back night after night. Did you hit it? No, we didn't hit it. Well, you're going to go back tomorrow. You're going to hit it. So they would just methodically take out each bridge. The Kerch Bridge was designed to withstand a nuclear. It was actually built by the Dutch. So the Dutch built it. Completely against sanctions, but it's very well made. And taking it out is very difficult. And again, the Ukrainians will have to do range systems. There was a discussion, I don't know if anyone, the German officers who were listening to, speaking unclear. I mean, it's an astonishing story. German officers, there were some in Singapore speaking with German officers back in Germany using WebEx, the most insecure platform. And the Russian just joined the meeting. And they didn't realize there was someone else in the meeting. And so they just recorded the meeting, just joined it, like a class, and listened in on this entire conversation. But if you read the transcript, the Germans are talking about how they would take out the power system. So the Germans believe it can be done. That they would use about sequencing the forces of where they did. The Germans believe it can be done. It's not easy. And the Storm Shadows and Scouts, which the Ukrainians have been given by the British and the French, aren't good enough. The Taurus is sort of a better system. The hardened attackers are a better system. The Tauruses and the attackers together would be a big thing. Right now, the Ukrainians
The large question, and maybe we'll come back to this tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. In the end, is the calculation that what will decide who are is how much of human toll each militia can take.
Can I come back to that's Thursday? Can I come back to that's Thursday. We're going to talk about the future of the war and the war. Everyone needs a break. Thank you for staying for as late as you did. And the few survivors, I'll see you tomorrow.